We've just went through a list of prayer requests, and sometimes it's hard to think about all the things that different ones are going through and things that we have to deal with in this world. And we should lift those up and consider all those things and ask God's protection and help. But we also have to temper that with an understanding of all the blessings that God has given us. A few weeks back in the summer, we were about ready to go for a walk and headed towards the woods, and there was a pile where I'd burned a brush pile. And I noticed something growing there. And I thought, what is that? And it had already gotten, a little bit of a bush to it. And I watched it and I looked at the leaves and I said, I think that's a watermelon vine. And somehow a watermelon seed had gotten out there. And so we watched it. And eventually we saw melons coming up on it. Well, we picked 2 watermelons about that big off of it yesterday. Now, we didn't do a thing for those watermelons. They came up on their own. I didn't till it or plow it, or they didn't even weed around it. I mowed around it. That was about the extent of it. But God blessed us with those 2 watermelons. Now, how many other things has God blessed us with? I cut up one of them. I've got it over there ready for us to enjoy. God blesses us in so many different ways. What does God ask in return? What does God ask that we give back for all of his blessings? This sermon is one of the tough ones. It's one of them that preachers don't like to preach and people don't like to hear. You want to title it, Tithe as God Commands. Tithe as God commands. Most people don't want to hear about that. But God commands it. And it's a command with a promise. He says, I've blessed you. And as an acknowledgement of that blessing, I would like you to give this portion back. This portion back. And if you'll do that, I'll bless you even more. Did you know that God commands not 1, not 2, but 3 separate tithes in his word? And these 3 tithes are for 3 separate purposes. Most people don't have a clue. What does a tithe start with? A tithe, the word simply means 10%. 10% of what? Well, it's 10% of your increase. We might call it income or profit after expenses. 10% of that. Sounds like a lot of money, doesn't it? But think about all the blessings that God has given you. We get to keep the rest of it. The first tithe, let's go through the 3 of them. The first tithe, it belongs to God. Belongs to God. And so in obedience to his command, we entrust it to him through his church. It's the very least we can do to show the gratitude for all of his blessings. And God uses that in so many ways. He uses it to teach and to proclaim the gospel. We're able to be in this building because of those tithes. And then God commands a second tithe. And when I first met Pam and she was telling me about all these weird things, this was the first time I ever heard of a second tithe. But we'll talk about that. Commands us not to give a second tithe, but to save a second tithe. And it's for a specific purpose. It's to prepare. It's for us to prepare for the expenses of joyfully keeping his feasts. his feasts. He knows it costs money. He knows it takes preparation. And he knows that we got lots of things going on and we'll forget about it. And so he commands us to save that second tithe. And then finally, God commands us to give a third tithe. It says to care for the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow in need among God's people. And we'll talk about that. And then, above and beyond all of these tithes, God encourages his people to give what's called free will offerings. Free will offerings. And those are not tithes. Those are above and beyond tithes. And we're to give those, and especially at the feast. Offerings are different from and in addition to tithes. And they shouldn't encroach upon them. They're for a different purpose. Now, the Church of God International has a thing called the Systematic Theology Project, or STP. I don't know if y'all know that. If you go to the website, you can go there and it's got all the fundamental beliefs. And then below that, it's got this STP, which gives you the same things in a lot more detail. So if you want to know what we believe, go to the website and you can get there. Anyway, in that it says, God should always have first place, not the last, in a Christian's mind when it comes to the proper use of his financial resources. God should be the top of the list, not an afterthought in the allocation of one's income. The first thing that comes off of our paycheck, if you will, should be that tithe. As we obey God with the physical blessings that he's given us, we honor him. We honor him. We learn about and we support the church's mission. And by doing that, we build character through our sharing and through our giving. Let's go to Psalm chapter 50. Psalm 50. And it teaches us how God views the world. How God views the world. And his view of the world is a little different than our view. But we need to have God's view of the world. Psalm 50, we'll begin in verse 10 and we'll read through verse 12. This is how God sees the world. He says, "For every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the mountains, and the wild beasts of the field are mine." Mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and all its fullness. That's how God views this world. He doesn't need our tithe. We need to tithe for us. God owns the universe. He's the source of all blessings. All blessings. Everything in the world belongs to God. But this tithing is a command of God. But with all of God's commands, it's our personal responsibility to obey it. Now, tithing is not monitored by the church. We don't check up to see if you tithe. Tithing is an act of faith. It's an act of obedience to God. It's also a matter of focus. It's a matter of our attitude, our inner being. It should be on love for God and love of others. To faithfully preparing and genuinely sharing with others what he's given us. It's having a caring and a giving spirit about us. We should be that kind of a generous person, every one of us. The principles of tithing were first revealed to Abraham. First revealed there. And then it continued through the Levites, and then they're taught in the New Testament as well. So let's talk about the first tithe. The first tithe. Now, God commands us to entrust to Him this tithe, this tenth of our income or an increase. And the tithe has been used to administer His church and to assist in proclaiming the gospel of His kingdom. That's what it's for. Let's go to Genesis chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14. It's where we see the first mention of a tithe. It has to do with Abraham. And if you remember this story, there's 4 kings, and they came and they had this battle against 5 kings. And all of the armies of these 4 kings, they defeated the 5 kings, and they came and they sacked Sodom and Gomorrah, these 2 towns. And when they did that, they took captives. And one of the captives was Abraham's nephew, Lot. And they took off with him. Going to make them all slaves. So then God used Abram. And Abram chose 318 men. Now that's not very many when you consider an army out there. And this wasn't just one army, it was 4 armies, all put together. God used Abraham and 318 men, and they went out and they defeated this combined army of 4 kings. And they rescued Lot. But what did Abraham do when he returned home with all the treasure that these armies had taken? Great deal of treasure. What did he do with it? Well, let's look at Genesis chapter 14. We'll read verses 16 through 19. Now, why did I put 19? I'm going to go all the way to 20. Genesis 14, beginning in verse 16. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shavah, that is, the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And look at the last line there. And he gave him a tithe of all. So Abram gave a tithe of all of this treasure to this man named Melchizedek. Melchizedek. He entrusted that tithe of all his increase, including all he had recovered, to God Most High, and that was the first thing he did. The very first thing. Before he did anything else, he took 10%, gave it to God. He knew that everything belonged to God, and that a tithe of his increase was already holy. It was set apart. It already belonged to God. And he didn't dare keep what belonged to God. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 27. Leviticus 27, verse 30. Kind of makes this clear. This idea about this tithe belonging to God. Leviticus 27, verse 30 says, And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree, is the Eternal's. It is holy to the eternal. And that word holy there means set apart. It's already set off to the side. It's already there for the eternal. Now, we won't go there, but if you look at Psalm 110 and then you look at Hebrews 5 through 7, it makes it clear that this Melchizedek was none other than Jesus Christ. He appeared in the Old Testament. And tithing to him, Abraham confirmed the superiority of Christ's eternal priesthood over that of Aaron, who was a descendant of Abraham. That tithing, it sent this message. Now, God commanded tithing to support the work of the Levites and the priests of Israel. Of course, this is much later. After Israel's exodus from Egypt, God ordained Moses' brother Aaron and his sons to be priests. Now, why he chose them, I don't know, but that's who he chose. Aaron and his sons to stand before him and all the people. Now, the whole tribe of Levi was also set apart. Now, Levi was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And so this whole tribe was set apart for a specific purpose. You got to always remember these tithes are set apart and they're connected with purposes. And here this tribe of Israel, this tribe of Levi, one of the 12 of Israel, was set apart for sacred duties in the tabernacle. They were the ones that carried the ark. They were the ones that set up the tabernacle. They were the ones that took care of things. They assisted the priests. And also, we've already covered this in another sermon, all of the Levites were involved in teaching all of Israel. They were scattered out throughout the land to teach Israel. Now, they were scattered out in these Levitical cities, but they weren't given any inheritance. They weren't given the land. All the other tribes were given part of the land of Israel, but the Levites were not given that. So to sustain them in this service, this holy service that God had called them to, in Numbers 18, let's turn there, God commanded that his tithes from all of Israel be entrusted to the Levites. All these tithes, they belonged to God, but they were to be entrusted to the Levites. And then the Levites also had to tithe. What they got in tithes, they turned around and tithed to the priests, who were the sons of Aaron. So let's go to Numbers chapter 18. We'll start with verse 21. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's kind of long, but let's just read a few verses. Verse 21. Numbers 18, verse 21 says, "Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes in Israel as an inheritance in return for the work which they perform, the work of the tabernacle of meeting." So there's the purpose for the tithe. Now let's go down to verse 26. Numbers 18:26, it says, "Speak thus to the Levites and say to them, when you take from the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them as your inheritance, then you shall offer up a heave offering of it to the Eternal, a tenth of a tithe," or might say a tithe of a tithe. I skip down another couple of verses there to 28. Verse 28 says, "Thus you shall also offer a heave offering to the Eternal from all the tithes which you receive from the children of Israel, and you shall give the Eternal's heave offering from it to Aaron the priest." So there's the mechanism. This is what was supposed to happen with the tithe in the kingdom of Israel. The tithe went to the Levites. The Levites tithed to the priests. So, do we have an example of that? Let's go to 2 Chronicles chapter 31. Now in 2 Chronicles 31, Hezekiah was the king of Judah. Now, most of the kings of Israel, all the kings of Israel were evil, and a lot of the kings of Judah were. But Hezekiah was one of the good ones. So Hezekiah, and he had led this revival of all through Israel, all through the land of Judah, I should say. But Israel had already gone into captivity in the northern kingdom. But this revival even extended up into the northern kingdom, and he sent people up there to tell them about this revival and about the feasts, and coming down to Jerusalem to keep the feasts. So in chapter 31, after cleansing the temple and restoring worship of God, the king commanded the people to provide for the priest and the Levites according to the law. Okay, it's time to do what God said. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 31. We'll read verses 3 through 12. 2 Chronicles chapter 31, verses 3 through 12. It says, the king also appointed a portion of his possessions for the burnt offerings, for the morning and evening burnt offerings, and the burnt offerings for the Sabbaths, and the new moons, and the set feasts, as it is written in the law of the Eternal. Moreover, he commanded the people who dwelt in Jerusalem to contribute support for the priests and the Levites, that they might devote themselves to the law of the Eternal. As soon as the commandment was circulated, the children of Israel brought in abundance, the first fruits of grain and wine, oil and honey, and of all the produce of the field, and they brought in abundantly the tithe of everything. And the children of Israel and Judah, who dwelt in the cities of Judah, brought the tithe of oxen and sheep, also the tithe of holy things, which were consecrated to the Eternal their God, they laid in heaps. In the 3rd month, they began laying them in heaps, and they finished in the 7th month. And when Hezekiah and the leaders came and saw the heaps, they blessed the Eternal and his people Israel. Then Hezekiah questioned the priests and the Levites concerning the heaps. And Azariah, the chief priest from the house of Zadok, answered him and said, since the people began to bring the offerings into the house of the Eternal, we have had enough to eat and plenty left, for the Eternal has blessed his people, and what is left is this great abundance. Now Hezekiah commanded them to prepare rooms in the house of the Eternal, and they prepared them. Then they faithfully brought in the offerings, the tithes, and the dedicated things. They faithfully gave. They faithfully tithed. And notice that God blessed them greatly. Let's go to Nehemiah chapter 10. Here's another example. Nehemiah chapter 10. Now this is a little later, a few hundred years later. Judah had gone back to disobeying God, and God had sent them off into captivity in Babylon. And then after 70 years, God brought them back from captivity in Babylon. And then he sent this man, Nehemiah, to get things organized, to encourage the people to do as God commanded. Let's go to chapter 10 of Nehemiah, and we'll read verses 35 through 39. Nehemiah chapter 10, beginning in verse 35. Nehemiah 10:35. And we made ordinances to bring the first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of all the fruit of all trees year by year to the house of the Eternal, to bring the firstborn of our sons and our cattle, as is written in the law, and the firstborn of our herds and our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests who minister in the house of our God, to bring the firstfruits of our dough, our offerings, the fruit of all kinds of trees, the new wine and oil to the priests, to the storerooms of the house of our God, and to bring the tithes of our land to the Levites. For the Levites should receive the tithes in all of our farming communities. And the priest, the descendants of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive tithes. The Levites shall bring up a tenth of the tithes to the house of our God, to the rooms of the storehouse. For the children of Israel and the children of Levi shall bring the offering of the grain, of the new wine, and the oil to the storerooms where the articles of the sanctuary are, where the priests who minister and the gatekeepers and the singers are, and we will not neglect the house of our God. Wow. Now, there's a few more mentions in Nehemiah in chapter 12, verse 44, chapter 13, verse 5, and then in verse 12. In all of these, this collection of the tithes is mentioned. And they were collecting that, and things were happening. The walls were getting built. The temple was getting built again, the second temple. God was blessing them. But sadly, what happened? Didn't take long, and Judah reverted back to corruption. And they reverted back to withholding God's tithe. Withholding it. Let's go to Malachi chapter 3. Probably knew I was going there. Malachi chapter 3. And this is just a little while after Nehemiah. In Malachi chapter 3, God issued a warning and a challenge. A warning and a challenge. And this is really kind of the crux of the whole matter. Malachi chapter 3, beginning in verse 6. We'll read through verse 12. Malachi chapter 3, verse 6 says, "For I am the eternal, I do not change. Therefore you are not consumed, O sons of Jacob. Yet from the days of your fathers you have gone away from my ordinances, not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says the Eternal of hosts. But you say, in what way shall we return?" And then comes the key verse, verse 8. "Will a man rob God? Yet you have robbed me." But you say, in what way have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even this whole nation. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. And get this, and try me now in this, says the Eternal of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it. Imagine that. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, so that he will not destroy the fruit of your ground. Nor shall the vine fail to bear fruit for you in the field, says the Eternal of hosts. And all nations will call you blessed, for you will be a delightful land, says the Eternal of hosts. How many times does he call himself the eternal of hosts in that little passage? 4 times. He starts off by saying, I am the eternal. I don't change. They were doing good for a little while with Nehemiah, and then they changed. They got away from it. They got corrupted. He's saying, I don't change. You're going along there, and I'm protecting you, but you're not doing what you should do. You got to remember that that first tithe belongs to God. It doesn't belong to you. Already set apart. To take it back from him is robbery. And God warned Judah that withholding that tithe was exactly the same as stealing from it. No different. And Judah and his ancestors over the years had been complacent and disobedient and rebellious, and they had neglected and they had failed to obey God's laws. But through all of that, he had not completely destroyed them. He continued to protect them through many of their trials. Now, they faced some of them, but there's a lot of trials that he protected them from. But then God, he gets really direct to them. And he calls them thieves. Not just any kind of thieves, but thieves that were so brazen that they would steal from God. They had betrayed their covenant. They had brought curses upon themselves. But then God shows his mercy. He always does. And he says this. He says, try me now in this. He challenged them. He says, test me. Obey me and just see how much I'll bless you. Just see how much. And God's offer still stands today. Try me now in this. It's been said by many people, no one can outgive God. No one. Now, who said this? Who said this? Well, God said this, right? But we have to remember that Jesus Christ was the one that spoke through all the prophets and said all these things. What did he say in the New Testament? What did he say in the Gospels? Let's go to Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. A lot of people look at the New Testament and they say, well, tithing, God didn't teach exactly about tithing. You know why? This was assumed. They had just assumed that this was what God wanted. They already knew it. But what did he say to the Pharisees? In this chapter, he talks to the Pharisees about their focus on tithing. Okay? But in through this, as I'm reading it, recognize that he never contradicted his command to tithe. Matthew 23, read verse 23. Matthew 23, 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe the mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done. But look at the last part of this. Without leaving the others undone. Now, the parallel verse in Luke chapter 11, verse 42 adds one little phrase. It adds that the Pharisees also neglected the love of God. The love of God. Now, David covered this a little bit, but why did Christ call them hypocrites? Why did he call them hypocrites? And what does the word mean anyway? What does the word hypocrite come from? Well, it's a Greek word. It has to do with people that were doing plays, and they had masks. The term means two-faced. Two-faced. You could wear a sad mask, and then you could put on a happy mask. Two-faced. They had known that they should tithe, but when they tithed, they didn't do it in private. Oh no, they did it in public. They made sure everybody knew that they tithed. And they made sure everybody knew that they tithed on every little thing. Now these are spices. Okay? This mint and anise and cumin, they're all spices. And not worth a whole lot in and of themselves. So they were calculating it down to the little nugget of spice. It was a big show. They were showing how righteous they were. This was their public face of the two faces. This was their public face. But they failed to put the same focus on these important foundational principles of justice and mercy that God had also commanded. They failed to put that focus on faith and on love, the love of God. How do we know that? Well, Christ knew. He could see it all. And he could see into those dark rooms, the dark rooms away from the public eye, where they showed their other face. And they plotted injustice without mercy or concern for truth. They acted out of fear and jealousy instead of love and faith. They plotted to kill Christ. That was their other face. Now, Christ was not saying there was anything wrong with tithing in this verse, but that they were two-faced. Their attitudes and their priorities were all wrong. Let's go to Luke chapter 18, verse 11 and 12. It gives us another example of that. Luke chapter 18, beginning in verse 11. This is where we have the Pharisee and the tax collector praying in the temple. Listen to the words of the Pharisee. Luke 18, beginning in verse 11. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. Isn't that interesting? God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. Evidently said that loud enough for people to hear. Now, God commands all his people to entrust that first tithe to him. It is a command from God. But it's a command with an amazing promise attached to it. And we saw this in Malachi. God will and always has blessed those who tithe. Back when Pam was telling me all this stuff about this weird religion years ago, we talked about tithing. And we had both wanted to tithe, but our former spouses were not interested in all that. But right then and there, we agreed that we were going to tithe. Now, this is 6 months before we were married. We were going to tithe on every bit of the income that we had. And we knew God would bless us, but we just could not imagine how he would bless us. It was just beyond imagination. I was so far in debt in my first marriage, I couldn't begin to see a way out. How could you make enough money to pay all this off? Pam felt the same way. To add on to that, both of our former spouses reneged on all of their commitments in the property agreement of the settlement. So we paid all of that too. But God blessed us so much in a year's time, had it all paid off. And we were building our credit scores. It's just amazing. But we have to also understand that all blessings are not financial. God blessed me with the knowledge of the truth. We've heard many testimonies of how God has blessed people who made the decision to obey God and tithe. And I'm sure many of you have stories to tell. You might ask, to whom should we entrust God's tithe? To whom should we entrust God's tithe? I looked at this and I thought, where do I go for this? And I wanted to make sure that I was teaching what the Church of God International teaches. So I went to the STP again. And I said, what exactly does the church teach as they've looked through the scriptures and they searched it out? So let me just read a section. From the STP that deals why Christians tithe and why they tithe to the church. It says, during the New Testament period, Christians in Palestine tithed to the temple and freely gave generous offerings to the church. And some people teach that God's church cannot and should not teach tithing today based on the New Testament's silence on tithing. This argument of silence is more likely to show that tithing continued to be practiced as promoted by Jesus. It was just assumed. Presumably, such a significant change, if they had chosen to abolish tithing, would have been written about. It would have been debated rather than accepted silently. But when the temple was no longer in existence, when the Levitical priesthood was no longer functioning, a new situation arose. Clearly, the responsibility of the church to seek God's will in applying the laws of God to changing situations became apparent. In this context, it's worth considering Paul's discussion of tithings in Hebrews 7. Jesus Christ, though not a Levite, had a more fundamental and ancient right to receive tithes as a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, to whom Abraham, the ancestor of Levi, paid tithes. Therefore, it is entirely logical for the ministers of Jesus Christ to apply the statements regarding tithing throughout the Old Testament in teaching the church membership they should continue to worship God through the same God-ordained system of tithing that God has always used, and which Jesus Christ himself supported during his earthly ministry. But now, rather than the Levitical priesthood, who is no longer carrying out the work of God, Jesus Christ has empowered his ministry to accept the tithes of the church, the people, in order to continue the work of God in this generation. The first tithe was used to support the work of the tabernacle, then the temple, and later the church. The first tithe should be sent to the church headquarters. The STP states, normally each individual sends in his or her tithes and offerings privately. The church leadership is entrusted to discern the leadership of Christ and equitably distribute the tithe according to the needs of the whole church. That's the way it's supposed to work. That first tithe goes to the home office, and it's decided how to distribute that. So that's the first tithe. What about the second tithe? How many of y'all, before you came into church, ever heard of a second tithe? I never heard of it. You know why? It has to do with the feasts. It has to do with keeping God's feasts. I never heard about it until Pam told me about it. At our house, sometimes we call it 2T for second tithe. 2T, that's shorthand, you know. It's a tithe, but it's so different from the first tithe. You don't pay it or offer it or give it. You save it. We save a tithe, 10% of our income, and again, for a very specific purpose. It's called the festival tithe. It's designed to ensure that God's people can joyfully participate in his annual holy festivals without any kind of financial burden. Unlike the first tithe that belongs to God, the second tithe is set apart by individuals so they can rejoice in God's feasts. It can be used for travel, for lodging, for food, all during God's feasts. When we went to Myrtle Beach, we had a great time. Great time. We had planned that for over a year to go to Myrtle Beach. And we had saved up that second tithe all year long. So we were able to cover all the expenses without any problem. It's about preparing. Now, we just went through the feast, right? Are we thinking about the feast next year? We begin preparing now for the feast next year, setting aside that money, those funds, that tithe, that 10%. Now, where does God tell us to do this? Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 12. Deuteronomy chapter 12 begins with God reminding Israel again to do as he commands. He'd do that a lot. God kept saying, this is what I've commanded. Do as I command. Continue to do what I tell you to do, and I'll bless you. He commanded them to destroy everything associated with the false gods, with demons that the Canaanites had worshipped. They have nothing to do with them. Then he begins to tell them about this place that he chooses. A place that he chooses. And when you see that phrase, it always refers to the feasts, where God has placed his name for us to keep the feast. And he commanded them to keep his feasts. Then he begins to tell them to bring their tithes. Now, verses 17 and 18 of chapter 12, Deuteronomy, tell them to do something that we might not expect. Okay? So let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 17 and 18. Deuteronomy chapter 12, beginning in verse 17, says, You may not eat within your gates the tithe of your grain, or your new wine, or your oil, of the firstborn of your flock and your herd, or of any of your offerings which you vow, of your freewill offerings, or of the heave offerings of your hand. And look at verse 18. But you must eat them before the eternal your God in the place which the eternal your God chooses. You and your son and your daughter and your male servant and your female servant and the Levites who are within your gates, and you shall rejoice before the eternal your God in all that to which you have put your hands. We're to eat the tithe. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 14. Get a little more detail. Get the whole command here. Deuteronomy chapter 14. And we'll read verses 22 to 26. Deuteronomy 14, beginning in verse 22. It says, You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. And you shall eat before the eternal your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain and of your new wine and your oil, of the firstborn of your flock herds and your flocks, that you may learn to fear the eternal your God always. Important phrase there. But if the journey's too long for you so that you're not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the eternal your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, when the eternal your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place which the eternal your God chooses. And you shall spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep or wine or similar drink, for whatever your heart desires, you shall eat there before the eternal your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. As I said, that phrase, the place where he chooses to make his name, refers to the feast. If you go to Deuteronomy 16, you can look through it. It talks all about his feasts, and it uses that phrase twice to indicate, these are my feasts. I'm going to put my name somewhere. I'm going to choose to put my name. That's where you go to keep the feasts. So that's what he's talking about here. God commands us to save, to set aside this second tithe so that we can joyfully go and keep his feasts. That's what it's all about. We go to the feast again. Why? For a reason. There's a reason for all of this. God says, that you may learn to fear the eternal your God always. Why do we go to the feast? To learn from God. It's amazing, my first feast, 8 days, learning about God, learning about his ways, asking people, talking about it. Like a mini course, 8 days straight. God blesses us because we're faithful in obeying his command. Now, we're not giving this money away, we're keeping it. We're saving it, but he still blesses us. We get to use that money. We get to enjoy that 10% of our annual income to spend during the feast. And he still blesses us because we're faithful in doing what he says. You talk about a win-win situation. You do this, you get to keep it, and I'll bless you. every year, we get to use that second tithe, that 2T, to keep the feast with great joy. Saving that second tithe has given Pam and me the ability to keep the Feast of Tabernacles in some places that we could not have gone otherwise. We've been all over the place. Pam shaking her head at me. Don't go into all of that. God has allowed us to go some places that we never would imagine. It's because God has blessed us. We did what he said, and he's blessed us in it. Now, there are some who confuse this tithe, this second tithe, with the first tithe. They say, well, isn't that the same thing? It's talking about a tithe here. But there's some problems with that. They say that this tithe, well, it just means we're carrying the first tithe to the feast and we're giving it to the Levites when we get there, when we get to Jerusalem. And then they share it with all the people. The problem with that is most of the Levites were scattered all throughout the territory of Israel. They didn't live in Jerusalem. They were in these Levitical towns where they were teaching the people God's laws. And they received the first tithes from the people throughout the year. And then they passed on that tithe that they received to the priests. So it wasn't just done at the feast. It was done throughout the year for the first tithe. And you notice as we read through these two passages that neither of these passages tell us to give the tithe to the Levites or to the priests. Neither one of them. But all of them tell us to eat the tithe. Eat the tithe there at the feast and to share it with the Levites and others. The first tithe belongs to God. We give it, we entrust it to the church as God's tithe. How could this, what we just read, refer to the first tithe if we're commanded to eat the tithes ourselves? Doesn't make sense. They're two different purposes. Something else is going on here. Something else. Verse 26 states that we should spend that money. Spend that money for whatever your heart desires, to keep the feast and rejoice in it. Are you doing that? Are you setting aside that second tithe so that you can go to the feast and rejoice in it? God commanded that second tithe to be saved to ensure that God's people have the means to joyfully participate in God's annual feasts. Second tithes should be set apart from our normal everyday money. Set apart. They can be put in a separate savings account to be used only for expenses related to God's feasts. Now, it's not just the Feast of Tabernacles, but all of God's feasts. It includes travel and meals and rejoicing at God's feasts. That's what the second tithe is. But now let's look at verse 27 through 29 in Deuteronomy 14. And God tells us about one more tithe. One more tithe. The third tithe. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 27 through 29. Deuteronomy 14, beginning in verse 27. You shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part nor inheritance with you. At the end of every third year, you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates may come and eat and be satisfied, that the eternal your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. Let's also go to Deuteronomy chapter 26. Deuteronomy 26, we'll read verses 9 through 13. And again, it talks about this third tithe, or this tithe of the third year. Two ways of looking at that wording. Third tithe, or the tithe of the third year. Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 9 through 13. Beginning in verse 9. He has brought us to this place and has given us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now, behold, I have brought the first fruits of the land, which you, O Eternal, have given me. Then you shall set it before the Eternal your God, and worship before the Eternal your God. So you shall rejoice in every good thing which the Eternal your God has given to you and your house, you and the Levite and the stranger who is among you. When you have finished laying aside all the tithe of your increase in the third year, the year of tithing, and have given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they may eat within your gates and be filled, then you shall say before the Eternal your God, I have removed the holy tithe from my house, and also have given them to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all your commandments, which you have commanded me. I have not transgressed your commandments, nor have I forgotten them. So, the third tithe, poor tithe, the tithe of the third year. What is it? It's given to care for the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow in need, because they go there to eat of it, in need among God's people. But listen to this. Just consider this for a minute. In 2023, in the United States, the average federal income tax rate was around 17%. 17%. And about 53% of federal spending was directed to social programs, including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, unemployment, and others. 53%. So this tax spending was about 9% of the income that year. About 9%. If we gave 10% of our income once every 3 years, it would be equivalent to about 3.3% per year of our income. So the tax rate that we already pay to support social programs far exceeds the amount that we're commanded to give for this third tithe. These social programs are already set up to cover this need. So what do? Well, these social programs cover part of this, but they shouldn't eliminate our personal obligation to charitable giving. We should focus on stewardship to apply the principle of cheerful giving. If we do decide to give a third tithe after all of these taxes, they should be placed in the local church fund for assistance to those in need, especially when government aid falls short. It's kind of a special situation. We're already paying it in a sense through our taxes. I'd leave that up to you. What is a tithe? A tithe, 10% of our increase, our income, our profit after expenses. We need to always remember that God loves a cheerful giver. But we need to remember that tithing is the minimum that God commands us to give. Just like the Sabbath, tithing is a test command of God. He gives us this command and he says, will you do as I've commanded you? Even though it might not make sense. You say, well, how can I afford that? God says, test me. Test me. It's a test command of God. Will we have faith in God to bless us? In Malachi, God challenged us to test him, saying, if, one of those if-then statements again, if we faithfully tithe, then he would pour out his blessings upon us. What a promise. Will you accept this challenge? Will you test God? Or will you refuse to keep that promise, that challenge of his? Will you trust God to keep his promise? It begins with a commitment to obey God and consistently tithe as God commands. If we obey God, putting aside his tithe into his hand, we can join in the privilege of honoring God and helping to spread the gospel message. If we obey God by saving that second tithe, we allow God to help us provide for us so that we can keep his feast with great joy. If we obey God in giving, as in that third tithe, we'll be helping to care for those in need. God commands us to pay, to save, and to give 3 separate tithes for 3 separate purposes. If we're faithful to God, to obey God by tithing, then he will bless us.